I'm going to next move on to Kathy Kelly, who is another one of my very favorite activists and most valued resources in the peace movement. And what Phyllis is for my mind and keeping me up with policy, Kathy is for my heart and the much needed reminders of why we do this work. She's a three-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee, a co-founder of Voices in the Wilderness, and co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She's visited conflict zones all over the world and carries with her and to us here in the US the stories of the victims of US foreign policy. She's defied US sanctions to get medicine to sick children in Iraq and Palestine. She lived in Baghdad through the US bombing during our 2003 invasion. She's been imprisoned for planting corn on US nuclear missile silos. She's braved the bombs of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza to stay in solidarity with the children of Palestine. And she attempted to break the blockade of Gaza, bringing food and medicine to Palestine on the Audacity of Hope, an aid boat. She's been to Afghanistan 15 times during the US war there. She serves as a constant North Star for those of us engaged in this work. And I really appreciate you being here, Kathy. And if you can take it away, we're ready to hear you.
Well, thank you very much, Will. It's, of course, good to be here with all of the peace action groups who have helped to gather us together. And thank you so much to each one of those groups for being active, for being out there on the streets, in the farmers' markets, at the fields where the drone and the manned aircraft are being maintained and taking off. It's very impressive. And I hope that this time tonight will help keep all of us, in a sense, toned up to do what Phyllis is calling us to do, to keep on going up against the warlords, of which the United States is perhaps the most well-heeled and in many ways the most dangerous, just because of the extent of our weaponry. Thank you, Phyllis, very much for your presentation and getting us started. And Chris, I sure look forward to hearing from you as well. Cole, thank you for those points that you made. And so to begin with that first one, that we have to stop making war on Afghanistan. You know, the United States was involved in negotiating a troop withdrawal. Had there been negotiations for peace, the United States would have been concerned about creating livelihoods for people in Afghanistan, because if people don't have jobs, then, you know, they'll pick up a weapon and fight for this warlord or that warlord, and the war goes on and on. But we didn't see that kind of negotiation that would have allowed for a changed economy. And with regard to what specifically the United States should stop, no drone strikes, no bombings, no special forces, no aid to rebel groups. I'm in touch very much with a young man whom I last saw in September of 2019. And he has fled because he really was genuinely afraid. But, you know, the last time I saw him, in a very hushed voice, he asked me, Kathy, did you know about Qadi, Khazir, and Jahanzad, and Sabur, and Bahadir? And these were four young men who, in Jalalabad, just outside, a big city outside of Kabul, had been sleeping when Special Operations Commandos trained by the United States broke into their home, killed all four of them. They were gathered together to welcome their father back from the Hajj, and neighbor after neighbor, storekeeper after storekeeper said these young men were not part of Daesh. And so people were living in fear of warlords, of Special Operations Commandos, of drone strikes, all throughout the last 20 years. And, you know, they still have reason to fear. President Biden has been so clear that he didn't like the idea of boots on the ground in Afghanistan or a surge in the boots, but he likes the idea of combining CIA and drone strikes and drone surveillance and special operations. That's not going to constitute an end to the war in Afghanistan. And I think we have to listen to Daniel Hale, because Daniel Hale, as an Air Force analyst, disclosed actual documents, US government documents, that showed how in one 5-month operation called Operation Haymaker waged against Afghanistan, the United States drone strikes 90% of the time killed someone who wasn't the intended target. And so the idea that these drone strikes, the drone operators, they see blobs on the screen, they don't see people. And the idea that somehow we can wage a kind of a war that's going to be more secure because we don't have boots on the ground, I think that's a foolish notion, and Daniel Hale should be thanked, not imprisoned. It's also, I think, important, as Phyllis said, to mourn the lives of the people in Kabul who were killed after the terrible catastrophe at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. Because those people, you can't hold children accountable and say, well, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. 6 children in a family were killed. Now, this time, I think there will be an investigation. There are lots and lots of journalists. And let's face it, in the last 2 weeks, there's been more attention paid to Afghanistan in 2 weeks than were paid over the collective last 20 years. So there were plenty of strikes, drone strikes and manned aircraft strikes that hit civilians and were never investigated. And this helped, of course, to build up the revenge and the rage and the desire for retaliation. And I think it also had to do with why, a lot of the people that were fighting for the Afghan government to keep a government in power didn't really feel a great desire to risk their lives on behalf of the people who were manipulating that government, almost like they were puppets, because they too had seen these terrible results. I want to go on to that next point: engage with the Taliban and establish normal relations with the new government, pay reparations for the Afghan people. I'm so glad to see that word reparations there. And I think reparations should be understood not only as spending money. And, we just are giving $10 billion to the Air Force for its over-the-horizon capacity to bomb Afghanistan with drones and manned aircraft from Kuwait, from Qatar, from the United Arab Emirates, and from the Roosevelt, a carrier in the middle of the ocean. That $10 billion, and Phyllis has also sketched out ways that monies could be spent wisely, that could be used for reparations. But it's not only a matter of the financial reparation for the bereavement and the torture and the displacement and the suffering caused, but also reparations should be understood. I guess you could, kind of use the word repair as dismantling the war systems that caused the suffering in the first place. We can't afford this war system any longer. It's grotesque. It diminishes everybody. And there's no way we can have a rational discussion about climate catastrophe or pandemics if we don't dismantle the military systems. So yes, we should pay reparations. And also, I think we have to acknowledge, what have we done? Phyllis mentioned that President Biden did talk about how the amount of money per day was $300 million every day for 20 years. Another way to look at that, in 2014, during what the militarists bragged about being the largest retrograde mission in military history because Obama's surge was coming down and they were sending the troops home. If you took the sums of money spent and parceled it out per soldier per year, it would come out to $2 million per US soldier per year that same year. There were many thousands of children suffering from the kind of severe acute malnourishment that leads to chronic brain damage. But iodized salt, believe it or not, getting iodized salt into the diets of those children can actually help the children resist brain damage. And that would cost 5 cents per child per year. So could we see Lady Justice in the scales? Where do we want to put our resources? 5 cents per child per year to rescue a child from brain damage because of chronic malnutrition? Or $2 million per year for soldiers, and amongst the combat veterans, still on an average, 22 per day take their own lives when they come back. So we must acknowledge these kinds of realities that have so sapped our credibility as a country that cares about other people. There's a network of surgical centers called the Emergency Surgical Centers for Victims of War. And I love these people. And so do people all around Afghanistan. They will stitch up anybody who comes to them. If the logo is on that truck or ambulance, it just won't be hit. And they've run 3 major hospitals and 41 forward operating clinics. And that same year that I mentioned with the $2 million per year per soldier, one of the head nurses at that hospital, Emmanuel Danini, he said to me in Kabul, you know, what if you just said bye-bye to 3 of your soldiers and you send them home early and you give me that $2 million per soldier? What will I do with $6 million? Oh, I'd build another hospital. And this is the kind of practice that could be in place so that the United States wouldn't be feared as such a menacing country. And I certainly saw this with the young people I visited. They were exemplars. They were so brave and passionate. They so truly desired to get rid of wars. They didn't want to see any more wars, and they practiced sharing resources. They organized the widows to make big, heavy blankets, and they gave those away to people in the refugee camps. They knew those places. They did surveillance with notebooks and pens, going up icy mountainsides to sit down and talk with the widows and ask them, how often in a week do you eat beans? How much does it cost for you to get water? Because the widows way up at the top of the mountain had to walk down these icy paths and carry heavy buckets of water back up, so the rents were lower. And then what was the age of the main income earner for the family? And if that income earner was under 12 years of age, that survey went to the top of the list. And then they figured out who they would try to help. So we shouldn't get the impression that the Afghans need us to come in there and save them. Oh, no, 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 no. They have many, many people who are upright, robust, strong people of great moral character. But they've been betrayed, as Phyllis said. They've been betrayed and abandoned by policies throughout these 20 years. They need livelihoods, and they need ways to feed their families that don't make them dependent on warlords, particularly not the United States. I say that there should be reparations paid, but I don't think those reparations should be entrusted to the United States to administer or even to collect. Have an escrow fund, make it under the auspices of the United Nations. But I think there are reputable groups who could help with advising and distributing. I think about the Doctors Without Borders, the International Commission of the Red Cross, the Emergency Surgical Centers for Victims of War, the United Nations agencies. There are 38 of them who've been working in Afghanistan throughout all this time. Environmental protection agencies, mine clearance agencies. And I think of my young friends, and right now we are so worried for them, we don't even call them by their names or their organizational name, but let me just say young friends in Afghanistan. Cole had a point about cleaning house in Washington, D.C., and that is so important. There ought to be a way to call the warlords to accountability. I want to mention 2 particular events, which I think historically ought to be almost like marker events. In 2017, in April of 2017, the United States dropped it's called a GBU-43 massive ordnance air blast bomb. This is the largest bomb that the US arsenal has short of a nuclear weapon. Huge, enormous bomb. They called it the mother of all bombs, which is a hideous name to assign to a bomb. But you know why they dropped it on a mountainside where there were, it was populated largely by sheep and by goats? It was because inside the mountain was a very sophisticated network of tunnels used for communication and storage of weapons that the US built. And so that was their spot, and they didn't want it to be taken over by groups they believed were hostile groups. And so they blasted the mountain to smithereens. But isn't that a telling statement that it was the US that built that facility in the first place, as way back in the history, Zbigniew Brzezinski had said, this couldn't be better. Now the Soviet Union has their Vietnam and we can bleed them. And they saw it as a Cold War success. In October of 2015, the United States began to bomb a Doctors Without Borders hospital. Immediately after the bombing started, the emergency room and the intensive care unit in the Kunduz province, the main hospital for a large stretch of that province, after that bombing started, Doctors Without Borders notified the United States government, NATO, the United Nations, you're bombing a hospital, you're attacking the emergency room, the ICU. And the United States C-13 huge transport plane outfitted with Bofors cannons and incendiary devices and Gatling gun type shooters flew away and then came back and bombed again and came back in 15-minute intervals for an hour and a half. And that green lighted the possibility that you could just bomb a hospital with impunity. The Saudis have done it. It's been done in Syria. But the United States has, in Afghanistan, set the standard, as Phyllis said, normalized torture, humanitarian abuses, undermining of human rights, shrouding it in secrecy, and walking away, promising investigations that never happened because the press and the Congress never really paid attention. So yes, clean house in Washington and use the Special Inspector General on Afghanistan reports that are filed quadrennially, have been filed every year by John Sopko, and take those seriously. The Afghanistan papers did take them seriously, but the general said, we're not going to really have to worry about those Afghanistan papers. And I think to some extent, they were right. Please try to look up the December 2018 USA Today story that describes with just unbearable detail how mercenaries, special operations mercenaries, got it so wrong in a particular village as they were trying to just get money and a contract for expanding an airport in a remote area of Afghanistan. And they hired gangs to do it. And then it ended up just becoming such a debacle that 91 people were killed by US forces with wrong information, 60 of whom were children. The wrongfulness certainly can be detailed for a long time, but I want you to know that a young friend of mine said to me in all earnestness, tell your parents in your country, don't send your sons and daughters to Afghanistan. It's dangerous for them here. And I think that the people in Afghanistan are people who've meant us no harm. They, the ones that I knew would engage in projects like getting as many toy guns as they could and gathering child laborers and burying the guns and then planting trees on top of them. They would clean up contaminated, littered riverbeds, start a street kids school so that kids would be able to go to the government school even though they were child laborers. They tried again and again, but there was never any question of them being seen by people in the United States. And so I think part of our work is to listen carefully for the cries and for the pleas and also for the wisdom of the people who have been so abused and so abandoned in the hubris of our war making. And we must, as Phyllis said, stop the United States from becoming the world's most menacing warlord and abolish all weapons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy.